patrons from distant lands, listeners of old, it is time once again to travel down the Hobbit hole. Except today you may want to be thinking less earthen tunnel and more glittering vaulted cavern, because we're stopping at Menegroth to take a look at Dior. So I just did a video on Dior's parents, Beren and Luthien, some of the most famous Tolkienian characters of the First Age, I would argue, and some of the few to really get a significant call-out in Lord of the Rings. And in that video, I touched on their son Dior, the first of the Half-Elven, because he's kind of an important part of their story. But it really got me thinking about how strange Dior's position is, both within the history of Middle-earth and also looking in from outside as sort of a fictional character. And I had a lot of extra thoughts. They weren't really organized enough to qualify for an additional video in themselves, but obviously they wouldn't really fit into a video focusing on Beren and Luthien because they were focused on a totally different character. So I saved them up to present informally and in no particular order, and tending toward no particular conclusion for the enjoyment of anyone who may be curious. I have kind of a complicated relationship with the character of Dior Eluchíl, and it's tempting to blame my pro-Noldor, pro-Feanorian bias for this, but that's really only part of it. For example, I have no problem with Beren and Luthien and Finrod as characters. I don't even really mind Thiccgol, but I find Dior uniquely infuriating. And moreover, I find him to be a disappointment, because Dior has what you could refer to as misplaced main character energy. Feanor himself would be another good example of this. And what I mean by that is, typically in Tolkien and in Middle-earth, if there is a character whose parentage is more than usually illustrious, if the circumstances of his early life are notable, if there is some space devoted to his physical traits or his personality characteristics, typically it's a pretty safe bet that what we're looking at is one of the chosen ones. One of those characters who's going to have a significant impact on the plot down the line. This isn't necessarily always due to the status of those characters. It's not always the case that it's the kings and queens and princes and lords are going to be the only ones who achieve anything of significance. And in fact, that's pretty commonly subverted. But if we're looking at a character whose parents or early life is somehow noteworthy, it's, I would say, like a 70% chance that that's going to be a main character, for better or worse. And Dior really seems like he's set up to do that, and then he doesn't. To start with, I mean, he's the son of Beren and Luthien. He's born after they return literally from the dead. So right from the get-go, those are two circumstances that are pretty unique and pretty difficult to replicate. He is the first product that we know of a human and elven marriage. On top of that, his grandmother, maternally, is an actual Maia out of Valinor, and his maternal grandfather is Elu Thiccgol, king of the Sindar. And it is no exaggeration to say that Elu has been a major player on the stage of Middle-earth literally since most of the other characters were in diapers. So we have all of that historical significance meeting its culmination in this single individual. And then, of course, we know his descendants are going to include people like Elros, who founds Numenor, and then all of the Númenóreans, and then Elendil and Isildur, and then further down the line, Aragorn, to say nothing of Elrond and his children. So both by his ancestry and his descent, Dior is a pretty pivotal linchpin. And then we have the details of his early life. So to start with, his appearance is very striking. He inherits the Silmaril from his parents, and when he wears it, he's supposedly the fairest of any of the children of the earth, whether that's among Maiar or elves or humans. One of his nicknames is the Fair, which is kind of ironic by itself, and we'll get into that. And then, like I said, he's born to Beren and Luthien after they have returned from Mondos to begin their second mortal life. The main thrust of the different narratives seems to have him being raised in Osiriand among the Green Elves. And then, even before the death of his parents, when Thiccgol is killed, he and his family move to Doriath, and he inherits Thingol's crown, essentially. So he becomes king over the Sindar and Elves of Doriath, which is the largest and most important single faction of elves in Middle-earth, certainly at this point. And he inherits a realm that's at a crossroads. It's been really suffering in recent years. So the whole Beren and Luthien quest for the Silmaril was kind of in a way the peak of Doriath's political power, but the Beren and Luthien thing results in Nargothrond being weakened. Thingol's had a pretty rough time with his daughter dying and everything. I know it says that on her return she heals his winter and he revives a little bit when he sees that she's returned, but he knows that he's going to lose her soon, so that's already a problem. Relations with the Noldor are not good, so Doriath does not participate in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, and that's one of the reasons, actually, why the battle goes as poorly as it does. It's not just a defeat for the elves, it's basically a rout. All of the sort of adjoining lands and satellite territories are basically overrun. Turin, son of Hurin, shows up asking for help, and then later his mom and his sister follow, and that results in Beleg getting killed, who's one of, Doriath's major captains and figures. Nargothrond gets totally taken out. There is a dragon involved. Hurin shows up to spit some additional curses at everyone because, that's clearly what everyone needs right now. And as a result of that, Thingol finds himself with a cursed treasure and a equally cursed Silmaril, and he calls in some dwarves to put the cursed Silmaril into the cursed necklace, and to absolutely nobody's surprise, this results in Thingol being killed. Even the strained trade relationships between the various dwarven kingdoms and Doriath get crushed. Mablung gets killed randomly, just cut down in front of the treasuries. Dairon is long gone at this point. Melian bails. The girdle presumably starts to fall apart. Dior walks into this mess, and not very much time passes at all, it seems, before his parents also die and leave him with the Silmaril. So poor Dior has really taken the helm of a sinking ship here. And yet we're told that his plan is to oversee a Doriathran renaissance, that he's going to start building the kingdom back up toward its former position of power. And that actually, for a very brief shining moment, it looks like that's the direction that they're headed in. Of course, coming off of the half century that Doriath has just had, you would argue that a couple of years with any kind of relatively stable leader would provide enough breathing room for some immediate improvement. I mean, at least things aren't continuing to get worse, which is itself a major accomplishment. But, look at the ingredients that we have in place here. Doriath is a kingdom without a king. It's lost a bunch of allies and made a lot of enemies. They've been aggressively isolationist for the past 500 years or so, and they're losing the protective enchantment that they've relied on to make that even a possibility. And into this dumpster fire walks an amazingly beautiful youngster. His mother is Luthien to Nuviel. His dad is Beren, son of Barahir. He was raised in obscurity, but he comes in and he says, we're going to turn this around. I'm going to take on the mantle of my grandfather. Very soon afterward, upon the death of his parents, in addition to his grandpa's death and his grandmother's departure for parts unknown, he ends up inheriting the great significant heirloom of his house, the Nauglamir with the Silmaril embedded in it. And if you're like me, you're thinking, okay, this guy may go out in a blaze of glory, but it's going to be a blaze of glory. Tolkien's using all of his favorite tropes on this guy. He's showing up at a crucial part of the narrative. I'm ready to see where he's gonna go. And then he ends up dying in the most pointless and anticlimactic way possible. Okay, the guy that went with Turin to go try and kill Glaurung, and he was the guy who didn't turn around and run, and the other guy did, and then, Turin's literally turning around and saying, "Way to go, dude," and then he gets hit in the head with a rock, and that kills him. That may have been just slightly more pointless and anticlimactic, but Dior is, a close second. Because what does he do? He ignores the Feanorians for a few months too long, and they show up and kill him. That's it. That's where it ends. And it's particularly frustrating because for a lot of other characters who end up making poor choices, they have the justification of some sort of disadvantaged childhood or some, crucial lack of knowledge that makes the whole thing really ironic, or there's some prophecy that's coming home to roost. I'm thinking of people like Turgon, who ignores the warning of Tuor. I'm thinking of Feanor, who flames out really early on, even though it looks like he's going to be the prime character, and indeed for the past, 5 chapters he's been the prime character. Turin, like we all know from the get-go that Turin's not going to end well, but then Morwen and Hurin also just kind of fizzle out, and that's definitely got some, fate or curse aspect. Even the actual Feanorians themselves who end up killing and being killed by Dior, like Celegorm and Curufin, are slain by the child of the woman that they abducted. They don't dare to, follow up with her directly, but after she dies and after they've suffered resounding defeats elsewhere, they drum up the support and the resolve they need to attack her son, and then they end up dying in the process. And that gives their arc a sort of closure, but Dior's arc never really gets off the ground, even though it seems like it has every reason to. This could have been similarly impactful, but even here in this final climactic showdown with the absolute worst Feanorians, it falls very flat, at least in the Silmarillion it does. Because what happens in the Silmarillion is basically this. Dior inherits the Nauglamir. He gets a letter from the Feanorians saying, hey, that's ours. He gives no response to the letter. And then in 2 medium-sized paragraphs, the Feanorians come upon Doriath in the middle of winter, they lay siege to Menegroth, they penetrate into its innermost catacombs, and that is where Dior and his wife are killed, and that is also where Celegorm and Curufin and Cranthir are killed. End of. And this leaves me with so many questions. To start with, Dior grows up in an actual intact home. He has both of his parents and one full set of grandparents around to kind of raise him. His homeland is not actively being overrun by orcs. By late First Age standards, he seems to have a pretty solid childhood. Beren was involved in leading the Green Elves against the Dwarves as they were marching back from Menegroth, and this presumably would have been right before Dior becomes king, so he's presumably been involved with some kind of military action. Moreover, Beren's willingness to engage means that I very much doubt that Dior was raised on a diet of tofu and pacifism. I would suspect both his parents would be interested in him being able to look after himself. It would make sense for him to have some respectable fighting prowess. And you have to imagine that his parents kind of told him about some of their exploits, so he really has no excuse for either underestimating the commitment of the Sons of Feanor to getting their Silmarils back. He can't really offer the excuse, oh, I thought they were bluffing. And moreover, Thi'gol gets a little weird about the Silmaril, but Beren and Luthien both seem to have their heads screwed on pretty tightly about it. The reason they're trying to get it is not to get the Silmaril for itself. It's so that they can give it to Thi'gol, fulfill Beren's oath, and be together. That's why I think one of the really important moments in their story is the reason they only bring back one. Beren actually starts to go for the second one because, why not? It's not like he or anyone is really going to get this opportunity again with the Silmarils right there in the crown and I have an iron-cleaving knife in my hand and Morgoth is asleep, go for it. But of course the knife shatters when he goes for the second one, even though it took the first one no problem. And it's hard to think of an example where destiny is intervening in a more obvious way. This far and no farther, exactly what you need to fulfill the quest and no more. And even just entertaining the thought of getting two, since you're already there stealing the one, is immediately punished in the narrative. Now, granted, once they actually get it back, there's a lot of other things going on that kind of take precedence, but they give it to Thi'gol without a look back. If anything, you'd think they'd be happy to be rid of it. And like I said, Thi'gol does get a little weird about it, between that and Hurin's curse on the spoils of Nargothrond, and Mime the Petty Dwarf being involved, even tangentially. Just the very fact of Thi'gol deciding to combine the Silmaril with the Nauglamir alone is a red flag, I would argue. But then him immediately getting killed over it, and Menegroth being sacked. If the whole knife-breaking thing was too subtle, this would be the moment where anyone with common sense and even a soupçon of genre savvy would look around and say, you know, I get a bad feeling about this cursed necklace with a cursed jewel put inside of it. Maybe you shouldn't put too much emotional energy into that object. Now, Beren and Luthien recover the Nauglamir and the Silmaril from the dwarves, after Beren and the Green Elves kind of mount a countersack, possibly with some Entish help. And then the way that Dior learns of their death is when he receives the Silmaril. It's like there's a knock on the gates of Menegroth one night, and here's the Silmaril, and oh, that means my folks have gone. And he looks upon it and sort of muses on all of the trouble it's caused, which, fair. But of all the people who would be in a position to realize that, hey, this thing is probably bad news, at the very least it's dangerous and should be treated with care, Dior is the top of that list. The sentimental value of a Silmaril should not be enough to cancel out all of the negative energy that's just swirling around it at this point. So, not learning from the past and from the example of his direct ancestors, that's strike one. Strike two is just the terrible political decisions that he makes. And again, we're talking like in half a chapter here. He makes 4 or 5 moves that just do not make any sort of logical sense. Now, granted, I'm not really great at visualizing things like terrain or troop movements. Honestly, the whole spatial reasoning thing is not my strong suit. But according to my best understanding, Menegroth is in the middle of a dense forest. It was deliberately designed to be unassailable. That's why the whole palace is underground. There is one bridge in. In addition, for centuries, you've had the Girdle of Melian around aforesaid dense forest. And in certain places, that has run up against other enchantments, like whatever Sauron was getting up to in Taur na Fuin, and just created these zones of what I assume are pure Lovecraftian nightmare landscape that would be pretty difficult to get through, much less bring, a whole Noldoran army through. Again, this is post-Nirnaeth, so nothing to the north is good, nothing to the west is good. Most even of the northeast is not great. Doriath is an island kind of surrounded by pretty hostile territory. So you have the questionable wisdom on the one hand of ignoring or overlooking or passive-aggressively even continuing to antagonize the Noldoran remnants that are your only potential ally apart from the Green Elves. But you also have the knowledge that all of that hostile territory is also hostile to the Feanorians. If they decide to make any kind of move, you know the direction it's going to be coming from. And what with the spiders and the dwarves and the human bandits and the orcs, I would hope that you would be patrolling what areas of Doriath were under your direct control pretty extensively. Like, you really should be able to see anyone coming. And if you see anything that makes you even slightly nervous, Menegroth was conceived and designed to withstand siege. This should not have been such an easy nut to crack. But no, it's like they came upon Doriath unawares. No, they marched through miles of hostile territory in the dead of winter with a ragged army that was by definition unfamiliar with the territory, and attempted to sack an uber-defensible superfort. Oh, and also they wrote you a nice letter beforehand to let you know that they might be stopping by. I'd expect this kind of move out of Caranthir or Celegorm, but Maithros should have known better. Presumably he was just too depressed and overwhelmed with grief and guilt to have much meaningful input at this point. I don't know. That's not the point. The point is that if Dior really wanted to hang on to the Silmaril, he probably could have. He should have been able to. At the very least, you'd think he'd have arrangements to quickly evacuate his family if need be and either get them to the mouths of Sirion or then go on to Balar where Círdan is. But no, they're just there. His wife is there. His wife gets killed next to him, and then his sons are also just there in the middle of everything, get picked up by the servants of Celegorm, and then Elwing escapes by the skin of her teeth. The line between carelessness and negligence is pretty thin, but I'm still pretty confident that Dior crossed it. But the thing that really makes it unforgivable, in my opinion, is not just that he's dumb, but that he's pretty boring. Especially since he should be like a drama goldmine. So apparently he grows up in Osiriand among the Nandor or Green Elves, and then he has to move to Menegroth, which is the center of Sindarin high culture. So you anticipate that might be an angle. And then supposedly, I went into more detail in the actual video on Beren and Luthien, technically, Dior should be mortal. He's the first of the half-elven, but apparently in lieu of other complicating factors and dooms and choices and the stuff that kind of comes out of the Eärendil story, having a mortal parent makes you mortal too, and there is a surprising lack of angst about that, because in almost all other ways, Dior seems very elven. He's raised among elves, he's beautiful enough you would think he would be assumed to be an elf. He marries an elf, he has children with an elf. Presumably those children too would then be mortal, but at this point it's not clear what everyone knows about how that works. Like, do Beren and Luthien realize that their son is mortal? Do they not know? Does he not know? Does he suspect? Is he concerned about that at all? And then when Thiccgol dies, he says, well, I'm Thiccgol's heir. I'm Dior Eluchíl Aranel. I am Dior, the heir of Thiccgol and king of the elves, and he marches into Menegroth and sort of takes over without a murmur. And he is indeed the rightful heir, but isn't that kind of awkward if the heir to your elven kingdom is immortal? And all of his descendants now are going to be mortal? Like, wouldn't that raise some eyebrows? And again, maybe Doriath's just so rocked at this point that it's like, I don't care, like, look, give us 10, 15 years of relative stability and, like, we'll take it. We'll have the Civil War later. And then Dior meets his end at around, like, I want to say 35, according to the annals. So just barely old enough to really be showing visible signs of aging, according to normal human measure. And then according to elven measure, at least the Valinorian elven measure, that's 35's really too young to be making any major life decisions, much less to be, like, a king with a wife and 3 children. Just one more example of why elven aging gets weird. But all the same, it's like there's no reference to any kind of hiccup in Dior going about living his life as an elf, even though presumably he's a human and possibly he's aging like a human. And given, like, the degree of the drama that his mom and dad caused, you would have expected it to come up. Now, I'm not really complaining about the writing here because I know that this is most likely one of those things where it's the history of the Silmarillion that's to blame more than anything. The end of the First Age, that last 50 or so years, was a section that Tolkien didn't flesh out as fully in his sort of final stage of rewrites as he did the earlier stuff, just I think because he had a tendency to start over at the beginning and then keep going until he got derailed, and so he only ever made it so far before he ended up stopping or getting off track. So my sense is that he just never got around to making the changes that would need to be made to make everything from the Nirnaeth Arnodiad on to the Voyage of Eärendil fit into the revised framework of the sort of new Silmarillion, post-Lord of the Rings Silmarillion. So poor Chris Tolkien, may he be praised with great praise. He was kind of stuck between a bunch of stuff that had been written in, like, the 20s, like the Tale of Tenuviel stuff, where this is the point at which Beren's just another strain of elf and not a human, and so Beren and Luthien are both elves, and then their son Dior is an elf. And then Dior does actually get to have more adventures. For example, he gets this very nice cathartic moment where I think it's Curufin personally comes to tell him, like, hey buddy, cough up the Silmaril or there's going to be trouble. And Dior gets to spit back at him like, well, if you're brave enough to come get it from me when you weren't brave enough to come get it from Morgoth, like, have at thee. And that alone makes his death way more epic. Maybe just as pointless, but a lot more epic and a lot more satisfying. But on the other hand, a lot of that material was just incompatible with the new version of the Silmarillion. It would have been a pain to make it fit, and Christopher Tolkien was in this position where he knew he was going to have to make some editorial changes, but he wanted to avoid having to write to fill in the gaps as much as possible. He wanted to draw from what was already there. So he and his co-editor Kay kind of had to stitch together the end of, like, the Ruin of Doriath chapter from this collection of very disparate texts. And I don't know the whole history here, but from what I've heard, this is one of the sections of the Silmarillion where they really kind of got stuck and had to dig themselves out with as little damage as possible to the surrounding story. So there's reasons why it is this way, reasons that are really beyond anyone's control. And you can dig deeper into the unpublished stuff, the material that's in Histories of Middle-earth and elsewhere. And you can do what I've been doing, which is the, well, we know this, we can therefore infer that kind of a game, and try and build out this character a little bit more. That kind of soothes the sting a little bit, but my gosh, it's hard to read this character because he has every advantage. He should be someone so epic, and even if he's gonna flip the bird to the Sons of Feanor, which he has every right to do, and go out in a blaze of glory and just literally burn all his bridges, then more power to him. Like, I have no room to criticize someone on that ground. I love me some pyromaniac antihero, but particularly in the published Silmarillion, that's not what we get. We get a cipher and then a whole bunch of unanswered questions, and it just galls me. Plus, I mean, he kills Feanorians, and, like, arguably the deserving Feanorians, but still. It's like, that's already a black mark against you. If you're going to kill a son of Feanor, at least have the decency to make a speech before and hopefully a dramatic dying proclamation afterward. Especially if your nickname is the Fair, and the main antagonist that you're going to be killing is also nicknamed the Fair. Like, what a horrible waste of resources and elven lives, yes, but also what an intolerable waste of potential dramatic irony to have Dior the Fair and Celegorm the Fair, and they're duking it out in Menegroth, and like, it would have been so cool. And instead we get, like, the most insultingly bare two-sentence summary. And it's just, it's not fair. It is not fair. And I am still not over it. So that is where I will stop myself. Let me know if you've also had that experience where you've encountered a character and you're like, oh, I can tell this is gonna be an epic character, and then it turns out that they just fizzle. Whether you had that experience with Dior like I did, or another Tolkien character, or just any character at all that you've come across in reading or any form of fiction. Also, let me know about any characters you think are way dumber than most people realize, because it's no fun to watch someone just be pointlessly stupid. I get plenty of that in real life. I don't need that in my epic fantasy. Thank you all for accompanying me, and I'll see you next time.